Hey, I'm Sean Gilligan from Longs Peak. Just gonna make a quick video showing you guys how to analyze some results from the composite output that we create in our software. There's a prior video that we recorded that does a high-level overview of the report as a whole, but today we're gonna focus just on the parts that analyze the results to make sure everything looks good before you start presenting the performance. Just gonna share my screen so you can take a look at what I'm looking at here. Great. So the first 6 tabs are really all just results that we review in that other video. The main thing from analyzing the results standpoint that you may want to look at here is just making sure everything looks reasonable and close to what you expected. If something looks very different, then really analyzing the flagged accounts and things that we're going to look at today is definitely important before you publish these results and before you move into verification. So the first tab that's really going to be focused on analyzing the results is the flagged accounts tab here. What I like to do is start out by just sorting by the largest standard deviation so we can see the ones with the biggest difference. So just to kind of show you what we're looking at here, this is each account that's flagged, the month that it's flagged for. It could be flagged for multiple months. And even if it's only flagged for 1 month, that doesn't mean that the issue that's causing it to be an outlier only existed for 1 month. We would want you to research to see if it affects other periods as well. Here we've got the number, here's the actual account return for that month, the return of the composite for that month, so you can see how different it actually is. On an absolute basis. This is the standard deviation showing how many standard deviations away from the mean return for the composite that month it is. Here we're just putting that into words, so it's either going to say minor outlier, outlier, material outlier, or even extreme outlier. So those are the main things that's highlighting what's different. Here we're looking at whether there's any cash flows during the month that was flagged, which can tell us maybe that could be part of the reason why it's an outlier. This is going to tell us the number of months that it's flagged out of the total months that it's been run through the software. So giving us an indication, is this kind of a one-off situation, or is this account an outlier almost all of the time? So putting this together, for example, we could see down here, this account was only an outlier 1 time, and it had a very large cash flow that month. So we could be pretty confident that the reason for the outlier was because of the cash flow, as opposed to an account that's flagged 23 times. We may want to research that further to see what's causing that to perform differently than its peers in the composite that it's in. So the way that we can look at that first, what I like to look at first anyway, is just by grabbing, you can grab either the account name or number. So just copy that, and we'll come over to the All Portfolio Data tab and find that account. So we can look at the full history of this account just to give us a little context as to what's going on. And what we could see here is that it was actually never an outlier until May of 18, and then it's an outlier almost every month after that. So what that tells me is that something must have changed at this point, whether it was a restriction being added by the client, or maybe it changed strategies, or they deposited securities and told you you're not allowed to sell them. Could be anything, but we know that something shifted. So what we want to do is go back into the client notes, whether you have things documented in a CRM or the client's files, or anywhere where you may have some notes on a change that happened, and see if you could determine what took place on that date. You could also look at transaction summaries and holdings reports to see what is different about this account and if there was some kind of transaction that caused that difference back around this date. The other key thing to consider is, once you identify the reason for the change, is determining, is this change based on a client mandated restriction or change, or is it portfolio manager driven? For example, if the portfolio manager uses their discretion to just make a tactical shift in the strategy because of market conditions, that would not be a reason to kick it out of the composite. Whereas if there are client-driven changes or restrictions, that would be a reason to kick it out of the composite. So we want to be consistent in that determination as well. Let me pull up another document here and just see as an example, when we look at the definition of discretion section of your policies and procedures, this is just kind of a generic sample, but you have something similar to this in your policies and procedures document. Let's take a look at and see if there's clear criteria as to determining whether a portfolio is discretionary or non-discretionary for GIPS purposes. So a clear example here is a threshold set like this 10%. What this is saying is that if there's a restriction placed by the client on certain securities or things like that, so maybe they say you can't sell this low-cost basis stock, and that low-cost basis stock makes up more than 10% of the portfolio, that is non-discretionary for GIPS purposes then, and you need to kick it out of the composite. If it's under 10%, then we need to leave it in the composite. So we need to consistently apply this rule. So again, just to reiterate, the main thing we're doing here is reviewing why these accounts that are flagged are different than their peers, whether the difference is client-driven, based on something that was client-driven, or whether it's portfolio manager-driven. And then what's important for us is that you make clear notes over in the comments section to tell us what the issue was and exactly what period is affected by that restriction. So for example, when we look at this account that we had determined has been an outlier very frequently ever since I think it was May of 18. If you determine that the client added a material restriction during May of 18 and that same restriction still exists today, the notes over here should very clearly state that the account needs to be removed from the composite from May of 18 through present day. If there's a different situation where maybe the restriction was added and then removed later, we would need to know exactly when it was added and exactly when it was removed so we can follow the composite rules to make sure it's included for the correct time period and excluded for the restricted time period. The reason why it's important to really spend time on this now is that verification firms, if you're verified, are required to do outlier testing. And the ones that we're highlighting here are very likely to be sampled as part of their testing. And you want to make sure that you don't have errors when you get into the verification, because that just can increase the sample size and drag out the process and even increase the cost of the verification. So getting this cleaned up now, make sure the verification can go smoothly, and also make sure that the what you publish does not have material errors in it. You don't want to have to redistribute with disclosures about material errors and things like that. Okay, so maybe we could just take a look at another couple examples. So let's grab another account, maybe this one. And again, just take a look at the context of what's happening with this account. So just use the filters so we can isolate this account, see what's going on here. Okay, so we can see the very first month that it's an outlier is a very, very large cash flow. This particular firm does not have a significant cash flow policy. If you had a significant cash flow policy, let's say it's 20% size of a cash flow you kick out above that, then this month would be out. In this case, without a significant cash flow policy, cash flows are not a reason to remove an account from a composite. There would have to be another restriction, such as maybe they deposited securities and said you're not allowed to sell these securities and they're not part of the strategy. That would be a client-driven restriction, and we would want to know what period that affects so we could kick it out of the composite. Since we could see it's an outlier here, it continues to be an outlier a couple months later, and then the account actually closes a few months after that. That tells us that maybe something was going on where it's restricted the whole time, but maybe not. Maybe this is unrelated. Maybe it needs to come out here and actually be in for these months and then come out when it closes. We can't tell that without some research going into notes on the client to see what they, when discretion was lost and for what period any restrictions were in place. Again, just to reiterate, really important, we have detailed notes on the comments for as many of these as possible. So we know if we need to go in and make changes to the composite membership before running the results. and if we do need to make changes, exactly what dates those changes should be made for. Other things that could come up, if we're looking at, let's just pull another random example here that we haven't looked at yet. Let's grab this one. Okay, so here we could see there's never really an outlier. It's an outlier this month. There's not a cash flow. It's an outlier again here. Not a significant cash flow. This could just be fees or something. So there's nothing really obviously wrong with this. It could just be that maybe it's an account that's a little bit smaller than other accounts in the composite, and so the holdings are slightly different, or the weightings are a little bit different. Being an outlier is not necessarily a problem. We just want to make sure that it does follow the composite strategy and is not restricted by the client. So going back and researching can help you determine that. If it turns out that it's fine, then you would make notes and say, something like not restricted, leave in the composite, or not materially restricted, or whatever the situation is, so we know it's fine. You looked at it, there's nothing that needs to be done. So the list could be very long. You don't necessarily need to look at every account. What you need to do is start with the most material. If you're finding that everything is fine, then you probably just look at the material ones and leave it at that. I wouldn't keep going if you're not finding any problems. If you're finding that every one of these are wrong, I would keep going until you get to a point where you're comfortable that you're not going to find additional issues if you continue to go down to the smaller differences. In addition to outliers, there's also other things listed here like 0% returns. So 0% returns in this case, it looks like not very different from the composite. So this may not be an issue. Let's take a look at this one just to get the full context of the situation over here like we did with the others. Okay, and we can see it's basically never an outlier. This is the only issue, and the composite was very close to zero as well. So there's nothing that needs to be done here. If you saw that this was very different than the composite, then it's an outlier in addition to being a 0% return and may have an issue. Also, if this was, say, the very first month or the first couple months that it's in the composite, maybe it wasn't invested yet. And something to consider is, what is the policy for the timing of inclusion in the composite? Here's just a generic sample. Let's say that the policy is to include new accounts just based on the first full month under management. Then maybe that's fine that it's not fully invested yet, as long as you had discretion and the portfolio manager was just using their discretion to wait and get the portfolio invested a little bit later. That's fine. It does need to be in the composite. If this was written based on percentage invested or being fully invested before it's included, then we would know that this account was incorrectly included in the composite a little bit too soon. And what we would do is remove it and make sure we're just consistently following this policy from your policies and procedures to include it. Again, this is something that verifiers test heavily, so we need to make sure that this policy is always followed right to ensure that when they go to do their testing, accounts are included at the right time and removed at the right time from the composite. Similarly, if it was the very last month, maybe we see that it's closing at some point and it is an outlier or a 0% return towards the end, we would want to look back at client notes to see exactly when discretion was lost. So for example, maybe you were told, let's say this account closed in September. Well, what about in August? Was the termination notice received in late August, so you didn't have discretion all the way through the end? These would need to be excluded as well. Even if it's not an outlier, we need to know exactly when discretion was lost, either for a restriction or for the portfolio terminating, so we can follow these policies consistently to remove at the end of the last full month of discretion. Again, another item that is heavily tested by verifiers, and you don't want to have those errors when they get into testing. It just makes the verification process very painful. We do have some other videos specific to verification. Please check those out. Going through each testing item, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But today, this is really focused on the pre-work you should do before publishing the results and as just prep work before you start the verification. Okay, a couple other things. So we've kind of worked through the flagged accounts tab. I think we're good here. Inclusion, exclusion, nothing necessarily needs to be done here. If you have a relatively small number of accounts, you may want to just look at, say, every excluded account for the year and just see if you're able to eyeball this and say, yeah, that looks like all the accounts I expect to see leaving the composite because of restrictions added or because of terminations. You can do the same for included, just to kind of do a sanity check and make sure that it's looking as you expect. The other area that's probably most important to look at would be dispersion support. And what you see here may end up just being the same accounts jumping out as what you already reviewed in the flagged accounts tab. But it's good to look here just to, again, to get a little more context as to what is causing dispersion in your composites. So on the annual dispersion support tab, annual dispersion is what we end up disclosing in the GIPS report. Let's just pick one composite in 1 year as an example to kind of give a picture of how this looks. So let's say we want to know what dispersion is for the growth composite for 2019. This is calculated based on every portfolio that is in the composite for the entire year. So that's what this list is. We can see that dispersion is 3.96, which is quite high. If this was a highly customized wealth management strategy, 3.96 might be okay. But we can see here that there's pretty tight management for most accounts, and then some pretty extreme outliers on the low and high end. Again, these are accounts that we saw on that flagged accounts tab, so probably would have addressed there. But if not, it's good to see what's causing that dispersion. If there are restrictions where these two accounts actually do need to be removed, dispersion is going to drop drastically because dispersion on this would be significantly lower than 3.96. The next tab, just to dive a little bit deeper, looks at it on a quarterly level. So quarterly dispersion is not something that GIPS requires and is not something that is presented, but just for your own analysis, it's here for you to review. Again, let's look at just 2019 to isolate that information. Let's see here. Oops. Okay, so we can see first quarter pretty low, second quarter a little higher, third quarter is the highest, fourth quarter is good again. So let's see what's going on just with third quarter. We can isolate that. And maybe just sort so we can see in order. So we can see a couple jumping out on either end that we may want to look at to make sure they do belong in the composite and there isn't any kind of restriction going on there. Again, with these removed, dispersion would be much tighter if we were only looking at these. So that's the key point. One other thing, if you wanted to look at dispersion on the monthly level, that is on this monthly and quarterly stats tab. Again, this is not something that is reported or required for GIPS, but just gives you an indication. There's not necessarily a good or bad number. It's more looking for consistency. So this kind of jumps out. Numbers are pretty low, and then we got a really high month. So something's going on there where an account is different. Again, here it gets high. So it's just a way to look at, is there consistency in the dispersion, or are there certain months when you see a month jump out like that, it can help you know where to research. So you don't have to look at every account for every period. You can just look at the potential issues. Great. So again, before you use, just to highlight the key points, look at these results to make sure they look as you expect. And before you go and publish them or submit them to the verifier, go through the flagged accounts and just make sure that everything is looking reasonable and no changes need to be made before it's finalized and published. If changes are needed, it's real easy for us to change what's included to not included, rerun through our software, and then give you new results. Sometimes we need to do that 2 or 3 times to make sure everything is looking good, and that's fine. Please let us know if you have any questions. I think that pretty much covers how to review flagged accounts and analyze the results in general before you go and publish your results. Feel free to reach out with any questions at all. Thanks very much.